Okay, so now that most of the art and the artists have moved to New York, there's going to be some changes to how artists are treated and who the audience for their art is. And so we're definitely going to see um, a shift. There used to be public exhibitions. The Impressionists did it, the Post-Impressionists did it. It goes on and on. But now, after 1945, we're going to see the beginnings of commercial galleries, people having art shows. And so, even though they have their roots in the Salon in Paris, they're going to change. And the commercial galleries is where the sale of the art becomes public. And so that means the public is going to be the major driver of art production, because as art becomes appreciated, it becomes a commodity of value. And especially in the 1950s and 60s, owning a piece of artwork by someone like Kusama or Andy Warhol, that's going to show a lot of prestige. And so that's going to be a big change. And then after the devastation in Europe, US will definitely dominate this new art market. In regards to museums, museums become an important source of national status and pride. So a lot of art gets moved into the museums. Especially after the war ends, the Louvre will reopen with a lot of art that had been stolen by the Nazis. And this also leads to controversy, because some of the museums who have artwork that is, let's say it's one of the pieces of the Parthenon, like the Caryatid. The Caryatid is in the British Museum in London, and Greece wants it back, but up until fairly recently, Greece didn't have the ability to maintain it and keep it from deteriorating further. And so once they opened their own museum in Athens, they wanted it back, and Britain won't give it back. And so there's a lot of clash in regards to what museums are. But it becomes an important civic institution, and it's a good way for people to see art in person, which I've said over and over again, it's really important. If to understand the size and scale and scope of art, you need to see it in person. And so that's why they become really important. There's also a change in patronage and audiences. We see a corporate patronage emerge, meaning the corporate entities will start paying artists or hiring artists. Also, sometimes artists, in fact, most artists work without patronage. They just do what they like, paint what they want, create what they want, and put it on the art market and see if it sells. And so that's going to be different. And then audiences will range from private patrons to the public at large. And then many of whom are really hostile towards some of the art we're going to see, because it really breaks with tradition. Some of these art pieces are really going to be very different than what we've seen in the past. Okay, so moving on to art style and characteristics. Let's see. It often challenges us to look at our own morality, behavior, and complacency. One of the things about art in the 50s is that it's often not pretty. It's often difficult to understand. You have to have that, like we've talked about before, that esoteric knowledge. What is the intent of the artist in creating the work of art we're looking at? And so it really challenges us with trying to figure that out. And so if we don't know what's behind the artist's intent, it's hard to understand why this is art, just like it was with Duchamp's The Fountain. So, and it's often, however, holds a mirror to contemporary life, meaning even though it's hard to understand, it will reveal things we might not see or hear in any other context, and forces us to confront ourselves in that mirror. What makes it difficult to understand is that it's become really diverse, and it's not easily defined through just using visual characteristics or artistic themes or even cultural concerns. It's way more complex than that. All right, so the New York School opens in the 1950s, and their first style that they're going to see, which we'll talk about with de Kooning, is abstract expressionism. And it's not like a formally organized movement. It's really kind of a loosely affiliated group of artists who have kind of a common purpose. And the purpose is to express their profound social alienation after World War II. And they want to make art that is both moral and universal. Again, they're influenced by theories of the psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who described a collective unconscious that is shared by all humans. So abstract expressionists like de Kooning and later Pollock and Helen Frankenthaler, they're going to aspire to create heroic and sublime works that have universally symbolic forms. And they share the commitment to four major ideas: an interest in the tradition of painting, but a desire to rebel against it and to recalibrate the ideas of European modernism; a desire to treat the act of painting on canvas as a self-contained expressive exercise; and also using, like Carl Jung's, archetypes for communicating universal ideas in painting. And then finally, the ambition to paint the sublime art on a heroic scale. At its core, the art is autonomous and deeply meaningful, with the act of painting itself often being the subject. So when we look at Woman One or talk about Pollock, it's not or the Bay, we're not necessarily talking about the subject. We're talking about the process of making art. Okay, moving on to assemblages. Assemblages is also in the 1950s, and this will combine often painting and sculpture into one piece. It is as intellectual as it is visual, and it's kind of leading into pop culture into art. So they're making art that's connected to and inspired by the visual culture of post-war America. They believe art should be anchored in real life. For photography, we see less prideful art, more critical, definitely social commentary pieces, particularly when we get to the Vietnam War. The photos taken in the Vietnam War is there's like 5 of them that changed the way people saw what was going on in Vietnam. So photography is going to be a real good way of seeing ourselves in the mirror. Okay, so in the 1960s with pop art, it's really a consumer culture critique. They're going to critique the mass culture ideas of like consumerism and conformist ideas. And so it's really, again, you have to like know that, like it's, otherwise you're like, why are they doing a bunch of things about soup cans? So you have to understand that it's a commentary on the connection people have to consumer items and being a consumer culture. For minimalism, it's formed at the same time as pop art, and it extends back to the ready-mades of Duchamp or the spatial and structural considerations of constructivism. Minimalists question the role, purpose, and relevance of art and an object in the contemporary culture. Often they produce slab or box-like sculptures, frequently made from prefabricated industrial materials. It totally rejects the handcrafted object as well as traditional sculptural materials, and would often present an object as a form divorced from symbolic or personal content. So it's a rejection of traditional materials and the role of the artist. Feminist art develops after the 1960s, and it's really going to challenge the convention that great art is only made by men. And it is developing alongside the women's liberation movement. And there's 3 different ways of feminist art. In the 60s, the first wave was to gain recognition for just female artists both past and present. And so this involved making women a part of art history, and important artists like the ones that we have included in the stuff you guys have learned this year. Another thing that in the first wave is representing the physicality and sexuality of the female body from the female perspective. And so that's very different and unique. It's essentialist and focused on women's bodies and defined women's gender in biological terms. In the 70s, we see this change to more relative terms. And so, like, there was an essay that was written arguing that if women throughout history were excluded from traditional art academies, then it was unfair to judge female artists at the same level as their male counterparts. And so this calls for a reevaluation of traditionally feminine arts, including ceramics, textiles, and jewelry making. And then the last wave, which is after our unit, it goes into the modern period, it addressed the expanded range of issues surrounded by the discrimination and denigration of women. Okay, the next section is performance art, and that's going to be, it's still happening from the 1960s on, and this one, it's recorded on film and video, and they try to, sometimes it's in person. A really good and different example of a performance art was, this happened not that long ago, so it wasn't necessarily in this section, but there was a woman probably about 15 years ago who was date raped in college, and the college wouldn't do anything about it, and so she carries her mattress that she was raped on to class, every class, to every study session, and she even tried to bring it on the graduation stage. And I'm not sure how that went, honestly, but it was just, that was a considered performance piece. So there's a lot of performance pieces. Yayoi Kusama is going to be definitely a good performance artist to look at, but it's very different. Okay, Earthworks is the one we're going to talk about is the Spiral Jetty, but one earthwork we've already talked about, which was from the indigenous Americans, was the Great Serpent Mound, but this is where it uses the earth itself as its art. It's made outdoors, and it frequently and pretty much almost exclusively uses materials that are on site, and it is site specific. It sometimes permanently alters the landscape, and sometimes it's temporary. So that's Earthworks. And then for architecture, we have what we call mid-century modern architecture, which is really 50s, 60s adoption of the international style. It's partially inspired by the fact that European architects immigrated to the U.S. and assumed important positions in architectural schools, so they trained the students to create what they were already doing in Europe. Also, the original utopian and revolutionary aspects of modernist architecture came to be used for structures that represented corporate power and wealth. And then for postmodern architecture in the 70s, that they're going to move away from that. They don't want to have these sleek frames, and they're going to actually be what they call less clean with more ornamentation, and it's going to challenge the international style that was so common, which began with Corbusier and continued through most of this period. Okay, we are done with art, style, and characteristics, and we'll be moving on to our first piece.